Hello, everyone. Welcome to In Limbo Conversations. Today we have with us Dr. Jana Morlon. She is from the University of Washington in Seattle, and she is the director for the UW Center for Philosophy for Children. And she's also an affiliate associate professor of philosophy as well. She's also the founding president of Plato Philosophy Learning and Teaching Organization, which is a nonprofit focused on bringing philosophy to schools, which is a very exciting idea. So, welcome, Dr. Lon. It's really nice to have you here for this conversation.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, just to begin, if you could tell us and everyone else about the work that the Center for Philosophy for Children does, and maybe a little bit about your larger work as well, because it's really interesting and I haven't found too many people who do the work that you do. So, I think it's quite nice. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the center was founded in 1996. It became part of the University of Washington soon after that. So we are an academic research center at the university. We're affiliated with the Department of Philosophy. But our work is sort of multifaceted. So on the one hand, we host international scholars who are interested in philosophy with children. We host conferences and workshops, and we do a lot of teacher education work. So we have a workshop that we do every June, as well as an ongoing monthly seminar with teachers and various other programs that reach educators. We also have a Philosophers in the Schools program, which brings University of Washington faculty, graduate students, and undergraduate students, once they are trained to do so, into local public schools to engage in philosophy sessions with children. And then we also host the Washington State High School Ethics Bowl, which involves high school students from around the region engaging with each other in conversations about various ethical issues based on ethics cases. So those are kind of all I should also say we also have a parent education program. So we do a lot of work with parents and grandparents around children's philosophical questions and how to have these kinds of conversations with your children. And I would say that so those are sort of detail some of the programs we do. I would say our larger goal in this work really is to help to have children's voices taken more seriously, because one of the things that we believe is that children have very strong philosophical inclinations when children are young. We all know children ask these big why questions, right, when they're 4 or 5 years old. And actually those questions often are echoes of issues that children are wondering about that are kind of the larger philosophical issues of our lives, questions about ethics, questions about life's purpose, questions about death, etc. And what I found in my work over the years is that if you really listen to what children have to say, there's a lot we can learn from them because they approach these questions with an openness that comes from being so new to the world that I think as adults, it tends to get diminished. So really the work is in large part to empower children to develop confidence in expressing what they think, to have an expectation that they will be heard, and to gain greater skill at being able to express their views, give good reasons for them, and be willing to take into account other perspectives which might be very different from their own.
That's very interesting, and that's a wide area that you are actually trying to cover. So that's really good. I mean, I wish there were more efforts and initiatives that worked on this, especially the whole social, not just the institutional part, but even the personal, talking to parents and all. I think it's pretty important. So that's really good. Professor, so before we really get into some questions, there's this one really interesting concept I came across in your work, which is philosophical sensitivity. And so if you could sort of explain to us what you mean by that, and because I think it's a really important part of what you're doing, and it's sort of the core tenet of your thing. So if you could probably
I'm glad you asked about that. And so a little background on this conception. When I first started really thinking about the larger deeper questions that surround this work. One of the questions that I often get asked and that I really think about a lot is, what do you need to be able to lead philosophical conversations? What makes someone equipped to facilitate conversation with children or adults or anyone? And, I can say when I go into a school or a classroom or a group of adults, well, I have a PhD in philosophy. Okay, well, that's, it qualifies me. But is that necessary? Or is it even sufficient for doing philosophy in the way we do it? And so a couple of things about that. One, the way that we engage in philosophical conversations, whether it's with children or with adults, is very different from kind of the standard model in an undergraduate philosophy education or a graduate school education, which often tends to be to read the great philosophers, understand their arguments, and be able to engage with them in that way. And that's all very important. But of course, that would be pretty hard to do with 5-year-olds. And I think there are also some limits to that way of doing philosophy. And I guess limit maybe is a strong word. More that I think it's not the only way. Often I think the academy holds on to that way of doing philosophy as the way. That's what makes you philosophically involved. And I think that's a mistake, because I think philosophy is not the province of the academy. It's part of being a human being. And so we engage in philosophical thinking all the time, right? When we think about, is this person really a good friend? Or what's the right thing to do? Or what am I doing here in the first place on this planet, et cetera, right? Those are all philosophical questions. And everyone at some point in life asks those questions of themselves, or at least questions like those. So I think that in order to lead a conversation around those questions, it's important to be what I call philosophically sensitive, but that's different from being a philosophical expert, right? Because a philosophical expert, someone with a PhD, for example, might think it's really important when engaging in questions about, the purpose of life to start to talk about what Kant had to say or what Hume had to say. And of course, for some people, that can be, they're not there yet. They're not that interested in what the great philosophers had to say, at least not in some very detailed way of explaining their arguments. They're more interested in the questions themselves. And one of the things that brought me into this work in the first place was when I was in graduate school. I felt like there were things about graduate school that made me lose touch with the reason I was there in the first place, which was that I was really passionate about the questions. And that graduate school, while that was a part of it, it wasn't the central part of it. The central part of graduate school often was kind of showing how philosophically sophisticated you were and how much you knew about philosophy and all that. And that wasn't really very interesting to me. And so, and actually at the time, I started listening to I had very young children at the time. My oldest son was 4. I started listening to the things he was asking and thinking, that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in talking about like what makes someone brave or whatever. So I started thinking about, what is it then you need to lead these kinds of conversations, which are question focused, so that you don't need to necessarily know, Descartes' dream argument or what the great philosophers have to say about the questions, but you do need to have sort of a philosophical sense. So I came up with this idea of philosophical sensitivity, which really is based on Aristotle's idea of moral perception, right? On this idea that we have these capacities, these perceptual capacities that can be developed over time with experience and training. So for example, you might think about an art critic, right? An art critic has great artistic sensitivity. That person has cultivated over time a knowledge of the history of art, a way of seeing paintings so that, for example, that person could walk into a museum and see a work of art in a way that someone who is not trained in that way just doesn't see the same thing, sees something different, right? In the same way, I think, the more that we think about these questions and we start to see, because you know how it is in philosophy, the more you think about a question, the more you realize it contains many other questions, right? And I think the more practice you get in thinking in that way, the more philosophically sensitive you become, such that when someone else is speaking to you, you hear the philosophy in what they're saying. Because many times children will make comments that if you are not listening carefully and are not very attuned to the philosophical content of their speech, you'll miss it. Another example is a naturalist, right? So you go walk in the woods with someone who's trained in science, and they see all kinds of relationships between the plants and the trees and the insects, et cetera, that you just miss. You may see other things, but you don't see the detail and the whole web that the naturalist sees. So I think in the same way, the more that you work at this, the more you start to see all the questions within the questions and the way in which a very simple question, for example, asked by a child, might actually contain within it layers of philosophical depth.
So this is
Sorry, that's a
something
long answer to your question, but
it's quite important. So I guess it is. It does need to be long. But it was really good examples that you've given. So if you think about philosophical sensitivity, is it something that you can sort of inculcate or you can grow in a child, or is it something that you think we all have is we have like a germ and then all you have to do is sort of water it and bring it out?
it's a really good question. And the honest answer is I'm not entirely sure. But what I think is that everyone has some measure of philosophical sensitivity. For some of us, that is of greater interest than for others. And so the more that you cultivate it, the more it becomes a larger part of you. In the same way that I think that everyone, for example, has some artistic ability. But for some people, that ability is not something that they follow and cultivate. And so it isn't as developed as someone who becomes, say, an artist. So I think it's like that. That's the way I think of it. And you can see when you meet people, and it's not, and I should say, cultivating it is not about them like studying philosophy necessarily. It can be having the kinds of inquisitive conversations with other people or reading books with a certain perspective that cultivates this state of mind or this capacity. So it's not that you have to become, as I say, a philosophical expert. It's that you have to kind of have that way of seeing, I guess I would say. So I meet teachers all the time, for example, who have no background in philosophy, but who have a great deal of philosophical sensitivity.
So in that, in a sense, what you're saying is you're not teaching children that 2 + 2 is 4, but you're just teaching them how to add stuff. You find that it's more important that they think in a certain way?
Exactly. Yes.
Training
Although
them
I
think?
don't even say we're teaching them, because teaching them is we have a certain view of what teaching is. So even though I think that can be questioned and interrogated, but given that we do see teaching in a certain way, I try not to actually use that term, because that term conjures up the expert at the front of the room, which is really not the way in which we do this with children or with anyone. So the idea really is to help the children to be able to articulate their questions. And for some children, so if you're working with very young children, say preschool, kindergarten, it's helping them to figure out what a question is and how you form a question and these kinds of things, right? And then they may have lots of questions, but they may not articulate them as questions necessarily. So it's helping them to form their questions and then to be able to give good reasons for their questions and to be able to understand what a good reason is and what makes something a good reason, and to be able to connect with what other students are saying so that the conversation makes progress in a way, and to help them see what that means. So there are lots of skills involved in this. One of the things I think I'm just finishing the manuscript of a new book, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is that a lot of this is about listening and really being able to kind of put your whole self into listening to what someone else has to say without starting from, okay, when do I get to say what I want or how do I respond, but just really being able to listen wholeheartedly. And I think that if you can do that, then the conversation becomes, in some sense, owned by the children. You're not coming in with, here's what we're going to talk about and here's what I want you to do. You're really following their lead, being a guide, helping them to give reasons, pushing them when the reasons aren't very good, helping them to connect to each other, what each other has to say, maybe providing counterexamples, all those kinds of things. But you're not there to sort of teach them about free will or anything like that.
That is a great point, and I do wish that was a bit more prevalent and people did think a lot more that way. Because I have also I've been teaching for the last 3-4 years on, and one thing that I've learned in those 3-4 years is that you can't really teach anything to people. You can only help them learn in that sense.
I
So,
love that.
and given that experience that I've had as well, and what you've just told us, I think that kind of matches. That is, I think, the best way to be a teacher or an educator in that sense. So that's very interesting, and I do hope a lot more people see that. And like you said, move the teacher away from the center, put the students at the center, sort of thing. So,
Mhm.
and so I would urge other people who are listening to this or watching this to really go and look at Dr. Lone's work, because I think there's a lot of this idea of teaching as well that you can find, not just how to talk to kids, but also this different approach to how to teach or how to even be a teacher and educator in such a situation.
Yes.
Which kind of brings me to a related question. Like you mentioned on the website that you have a lot of resources for people. So if they have certain questions, they can go there and check the questions and see those things. Uh, so our generally as adults or as parents, our first reaction usually is to answer questions in like a piecemeal fashion. For example, so if you get a big question about something, you just answer it, like give an answer and then move away. Like it's not a larger thing or anything. Uh, but I don't, is that the best way to do it? Or is there a more holistic approach where you sort of encourage the child to think about it more as opposed to just giving them an answer and being like, that's the big
Yeah.
question answered for today.
Yeah. So I would say it depends. If a child is asking you, how do you tie your shoes? Then probably the simplest thing to do is show them how to tie their shoes and not turn it into a deeper conversation, because really they're not asking for that, right? Um, but if a child is, so say you're reading a story at the end of the day, and the child asks a question like, a lot of children ask a question like, why do people have to die? And I think often adults do two things in response to that. One, we shy away from it because we don't really like to talk about death in the first place. And we also are afraid that the child's going to get upset or is worried, and so we provide a response that is meant to be comforting, right? Like, well, that's not something you have to worry about for a long time, or it's not going to happen to anyone you love for a long time, none of which is true necessarily, right? But that's the kind of comforting, which is understandable, right? We don't want the child to go to sleep anxious or worried. Or we might provide just a kind of a simple answer like, well, that's the cycle of life and everything lives in blah, 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 blah. And part of the reason for that, I think, is as adults, we're used to being the advisors, the experts. And so when a child asks a question, we think that our job is to provide an answer. And when the question is a question that is like the question, why do people have to die? Or why can someone be your friend one day and not your friend the next day? Or why are people mean to each other? Those questions are questions for which we don't really have final answers. And it's an opportunity to engage with your child or with the children in your lives in a different way, so that rather than the initial providing the answer response, you might just stop, pause, think about it for a minute, maybe ask a question like, well, so why do you ask that? Or what do you think? And turn it into more of a shared inquiry, into a question that is really puzzling for all of us as human beings, right? And that I found, so I have 3 children. And I found as they were growing up that those kinds of conversations lent a dimension to our relationship that was profoundly respectful, mutually respectful. So that even though I was still their parent and there were times where, we disagreed and I got to decide and, all those kinds of things, there was this space in our relationship where we would have these kinds of conversations and we were more on an equal footing because we were exploring together, each from our own perspectives, right? My perspective being one of someone with more experience, life experience, and maybe conceptual sophistication, but their perspective of someone who doesn't assume they know a whole lot of things and is maybe more open to possibilities and more imaginative about thinking about various ways of resolving a question or a problem. And so together we would be able to think about these questions in ways that were really mutually beneficial to both of us. And I think that those kinds of opportunities are so important in parenting, grandparenting, teaching. I mean, any relationship, camp counselors, any relationship that you have with children, because children so often get the message that they don't know anything. What they think is really not of very much value. Their role in life is just to grow up and to develop into the kind of adult, a healthy adult, which, is fine. But childhood is not just becoming an adult. Childhood is an important time in itself. And the more we can sort of give children the sense that we value where they are right now and what they're thinking about, I think that that's an enormous gift to give a child, and it helps develop confidence in the way they see the world and in their own judgments, and then a willingness to express what they think.
Thank you. That's a very that's a very nice answer that not only looks at just how children think, but also how it can, like you said, help our relations, like help our better relations with our children. It's something we don't really think about when we're answering these questions and
Yeah.
see all those things. I do have a couple more questions, Professor. If you, in relation to this, for example, are there any, well, before that, what do you think really stops us from taking children seriously as adults? For example, like what is there something one something that you can point out to? Uh, I,
Well, I don't know
there's,
that there's. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish your question.
there's one quote that I saw. There was this article of yours on Business Insight. I'm not sure where it was, but there's an article where you shared a lot of quotes that you came across when you were talking to kids, and maybe I can pull up one of them. One of them is this one, where childhood is not just about.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
Right.
it sort of shows that the break between being a kid and being an adult, and something sort of we leave something behind, or as adults we don't sort of take some things along with us. We leave them back in childhood. Is there something like that? Is there something that stops us from taking children seriously up to a point because of that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. One, and I'll just name a few. There actually in the book, my new book, there's a chapter on childhood in which I talk about this very issue, and there's a larger excerpts from these conversations with children about the subject and the things they have to say about it. But I think one element of this is that we are very much influenced by a developmental model of children. So we see children as in the process of becoming adults, and we see them as kind of unfinished human beings, gradually attaining the maturity of an adult as kind of the goal. And so we tend to pigeonhole children by, oh, well, that's, how 4-year-olds are. Or, yeah, well, look, she's only 10. And that kind of stops us from seeing them, right? It's this danger of a single story, right? We just see the child as opposed to a whole person, of which being a child is one part of that person's identity, but it's not fully who they are. So I think that's part of it, is this whole developmental model that we're very deeply influenced by. I think the other part of it you alluded to is that when we were children, we weren't very much listened to or taken seriously for the most part, unless we were quite fortunate. And so we sort of we absorbed that message that children are to be seen and not heard, right? Children are not really valuable members of the community in terms of participants. They're valuable in that we all care about children. We want them to have healthy childhoods and grow up into healthy adults. But much of that is really future focused, that we want to help them to grow into the adults we aspire for them to become, and not necessarily focused on how important childhood itself is and the experience that a child is having and the way in which that child might want to express their perspective on the world. We don't see that as particularly valuable, I think in large part because our perspectives when we were 8 and 10 weren't seen as particularly valuable, and maybe we just haven't questioned that very much.
All right. And if I were to push this a bit, especially nowadays with the pandemic, and we have a lot of questions from kids with big, about big issues and stuff like death, and like you mentioned, even things about loneliness, not meeting friends, a lot of these big things. But in general, if are there any cardinal rules that you can put out, maybe a handful of them for talking to children? I think one of them you mentioned was listening, which is very important. So like those, are there like a few things that irrespective of the situation, maybe an adult or a teacher can sort of keep in mind when they're talking to a student?
Yeah, I think the other just sort of general rule that I try to pay attention to, although I'm not always successful at it, is I think often we want to help children, which is, a laudable aspiration, right? But as a result, I think Maria Montessori talks somewhere about, how unhelpful help can be sometimes for children, because so a child will be trying to articulate something and we'll think we know what the child is trying to say. And so we'll help by kind of finishing the sentence or saying, oh, is this what you meant? And I mean, it's a natural thing to do, and I do it often, but I really try to be careful about it, because I think often what can happen is we actually don't know what the child was going to say. But when we suggest what we think the child was going to say, because the child has absorbed the idea that adults know best, will say, oh yeah, you're right, that's what I meant. And when in fact, it's not what the child meant at all. So I think it's really important to be wary of how much we think we know about the child and what the child thinks and feels and is willing to share with us, and to try to hold back as much as possible until the child has the space to say what he or she is trying to say. And I think that part of that, and that this is true for both for individual exchanges, but also for teachers, is to be comfortable with silence, to develop sort of an ability to let there be pauses and not need to jump in and fill them. Because I think that's, especially in Western culture, that's a very strong tendency. I have it, I know, but I really work at it. I mean, I will, when there's a pause in a conversation in a classroom, I'll let it sit, and then I'll start to get uncomfortable. And so I'll let it sit some more until I get really uncomfortable. And I find that if I do that, then a child who is otherwise unlikely to speak will say something, right? Because that child just needed a space to think before being ready to speak. So I think that's another part of this. And I will say on the pandemic, just as an aside, we do have on our website a little handbook that we put together with ideas for books and videos and other prompts or resources that parents might use to talk with their children about things like loneliness and isolation, or illness and death, or boredom, and some of the other questions and issues that are coming up for children right now.
Right. We will link all of these down in the description. So if you're interested, please do go and check it out. It'll be on the video as well as the end of the website. So it also sounds like this is kind of a reciprocal relation for us as adults when we're sitting and we're listening, and helps us also sort of investigate and interrogate our own assumptions by the sounds of what you're saying. If we give the child a space to speak, maybe we sort of encounter things we never thought about. So that's also quite an interesting aspect of that.
Absolutely.
So, right. I think that's it, Professor. I just have one small question. Has there been any question that you've had trouble answering with kids, especially recently? Has there been any question that's given you any trouble? Like,
Uh,
I have not been able to
oh,
answer the question at all. Or
sure. I mean, all the time children will ask questions that stump me, or that maybe I've thought about, but I find equally perplexing. So yeah, I think that happens.
how do you respond to that, to a kid like who comes up to you and assumes you have all the answers and they ask you a question? And
I actually had a great experience this winter, right before the pandemic, where I was in a third grade classroom and we were talking about thinking and like, what is a thought? And how do you know you're thinking? And what's the difference between thinking and feeling, and et cetera, et cetera. It was really interesting. And at the end of it, one of the children raised her hand and she said, "So what's the answer?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "What do you mean you don't know? You're a professor. You're supposed to have the answers." So, yeah.
That's great, Professor. Thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you for taking out the time. I would encourage everyone to please go ahead and check out the resources that Professor Lone mentioned, as well as her work. We'll link all of them in the description. So do go out and check. They should help you to talk to your kids or anyone else and probably get not just better relations, but also help them answer and help them grow as individuals as well. So thank you, Doctor. Thank you for your work as well. It's really admirable work. And I hope more people learn and are helped by your work.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. It was really great.
Thank you.